All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this discussion about different engineering productivity frameworks and how you can apply them in your organization. This is a lead dev webinar created in partnership with DX. It will last around 60 minutes, after which both myself and the panelists are going to head over to the lead dev Slack channel to answer some of your questions in the Effective Teams channel. We may also have time to answer questions live, so submit those via the Q&A feature on Zoom. I'm going to do my best to answer some of those throughout where it makes sense, but then we'll have some time at the end in order to get through anything we haven't gotten to. So let's get started with some introductions. My name is Dominique Simino-Ritchie. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Affinity, a relationship intelligence platform that helps deal makers find, manage, and close more deals. I'm joined today by some great engineering leaders on the panel who have experience with platform engineering teams, leading engineering at scale, and making some of these decisions to improve developer productivity using these frameworks within their organizations. So let's get started with some introductions. David, can you go?
Yeah, hi, I'm David Betts. I'm calling in from Boise, Idaho, USA. I currently lead the developer platform organization at Twilio Segment, which is the leading customer data platform. A large part of my team's charter is conducting and analyzing the quarterly developer experience survey using DX. And I'm looking forward to the discussion on driving change using developer productivity metrics, most importantly, using qualitative sentiment.
Awesome. Thank you, David. Mariana, you want to go?
Hi, I'm Mariana Raiko. I'm VP of Engineering at TrueLayer. I'm looking after all product engineering teams. I have many years of experience leading different teams in different industries across mechanical CAD, set-top box, and fintech. And I always found problem of optimizing software development to deliver value faster very fascinating. So now with arrival of different metrics, different frameworks, I found this task a little bit easier.
That's great. And it'll be nice to hear your perspective from the product engineering organization as well. Adam, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Adam Regal. I lead the developer platform team here at DoorDash in not so sunny Bay Area. Been at DoorDash for 4 years, where I've seen this org grow from a single one or two folks thinking about our productivity vision to an entire platform focused on backend, front end, mobile, tooling, and now most recently AI productivity as well, which I think is going to be crucial for the future of productivity. So excited to be here to chat about what everyone feels about this.
That's great. I'm sure now that you've said the keyword AI, someone's going to ask a question about it. Awesome. And last but not least, Abhi, can you introduce yourself for everybody?
Yeah, my name is Abhi Noda. I'm co-founder and CEO of DX, which is a solution for helping organizations measure developer experience and productivity. I've spent the past 10 years in this productivity problem space, first as a CTO, trying to measure the productivity of my teams, and then starting a company called Panda, which provided analytics on developer productivity. And most recently, I worked at Microsoft and GitHub, and then started DX to continue trying to solve this really difficult problem. So really excited to be here today and for this discussion.
That's great. So thanks a lot for being here. So today we're going to explore 3 popular frameworks, DORA, SPACE, and DevEx, used to measure and improve developer productivity. We're going to delve into their differences, the similarities, practical applications, and how to choose the best approach for your organization. So why don't we start with an overview of each of these frameworks? And Abhi, since you've built a career on measuring and improving developer productivity, can you define them for us?
Yeah, and I would say, there's more frameworks out there, but most engineering leaders you talk to, when you bring up developer productivity, these are the 3 that you'll hear brought up. DORA refers to the DORA 4 key metrics, which is actually a research program at Google now. But the 4 key metrics were popularized from the book Accelerate, written by my colleague, Dr. Nicole Forsgren, almost a decade ago. SPACE is a more recent framework. It was a paper that was published in, I believe it was 2020, right at the start of the pandemic, focused on providing a pretty open-ended framework on how organizations should be thinking about productivity and measuring it. And then most recently, I was one of the co-authors of the DevEx framework. And the DevEx framework really built on SPACE. A big part of SPACE was the message that we need to be focused on more than just the typical activity metrics that a lot of engineering organizations focus on. We need to also pay attention to how developers feel and what developers can tell us about the developer experience. And Space left how to actually do that pretty open-ended. And so the DevEx framework was written by myself and the co-authors of Space to build on where Space had sort of left off and provide a more practical approach for applying that in an organization. So all three frameworks are great. They all actually overlap. It's not really a question of which one should you use. Each has a different lens into the same problem. And really, all three provide important principles and guidance on how we should go about measuring.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And like you said, each of these frameworks have their own advantages. They can be applied and used differently for your team, depending on what you might want to invest in. So Adam, why don't you get us started by telling us what your interpretation of the Space framework is and how you went about adopting it at DoorDash?
Yeah, sure. And just hearing that about when Space came out during COVID brought back nostalgic memories of sort of those early days when we were all kind of coming up with DevPlat together. So right around the time we were at DoorDash, we were thinking about developer velocity and starting to come up with some OKRs around those objective key results. Google is famous for those. And as folks most likely know on the call, coming up with OKRs for platform projects, much less productivity, is nigh impossible. But a engineer in our org surfaced this paper about Space. And the more I read it, the more I was just like, this is it. This is the final piece that we've been missing. This captures everything that we're trying to do. This is perfect. But then it was kind of like the the drawing of here's the circle, here's the beak, and then question mark. Okay, now you have an owl. They're sort of missing parts in the middle there. A good example is we wanted to measure sort of onboarding time of engineers, and we were tracking nth time to PR. Spotify is famous for this as part of their their backstage pitch. But we found that while we could measure satisfaction and efficiency, the S and the E, the performance, much less the collaboration part, were really something that we found difficult to quantify. So over time, while it was a good starting point, I think it was more useful as starting the conversation rather than something that we were able to turn into a full-fledged framework for measuring everything perfectly.
Yeah, I've had similar experiences with Space where it's great to ask high-level questions, but it's a challenge to actually then decide how do you apply these and exactly what does that mean for your workflows and even your OKRs afterwards. David, when you joined Twilio, there were already quite a few frameworks in place, I believe. So can you tell us a little bit about what was there and how you chose to evolve the team?
Yeah, so when I first joined Twilio 2 years ago, we already had the DORA metrics in place and we had a very consistent process for reviewing them. But since we were a post-DevOps transformed company, it kind of felt like we had hit a global maximum on improvements. And to be fair, there were and still are like local opportunities for teams to improve based on the DORA metrics. But when we were reviewing those metrics, it started to feel like it was overhead and people were just tuning out. Since its founding, Twilio has promoted a very developer-centric culture of ask your developer. So the developer sentiment surveys really felt like a natural extension of that foundational culture. And previously we'd experimented with like ad hoc surveys on developer experience, but not with a lot of rigor. So our sense was that the lived experience of the developers wasn't really reflected in the DORA metrics that we were analyzing every week. And we wanted a more scientific approach to how we measured and evaluated developer sentiment. So we partnered with Obby and DX, and we launched our first developer experience sentiment-based survey. And right out of the gate, we hit 90% response rate, and we had a massive number of free text comments. So we were hooked. And in the 8 quarters that we've been running these surveys, we've built up a methodology of using this data to drive our internal platform roadmap, and also a practice of guiding teams to improve locally.
That's great. And so now it has to be part of your job. You lead platform engineering teams. Mariana, you've made it part of your role to ensure that when you join an engineering organization, you prioritize some of this. And so when you joined TrueLayer, what did you want to achieve when you started measuring developer productivity?
So for me, usually when I join a new company, for me as a role, as an engineering leader role, I see environment for engineer to succeed, to do their best is one of the most important aspects of my role. So for me, when I have tools or frameworks to understand or debug this environment, it makes my job much easier. And for a long time, I know if this environment is right, the value for the company is delivered faster.
I couldn't agree more. So we've heard about some of your goals. Abhi, what are some of the goals that you hear when you talk to different companies about adopting these frameworks and starting to run potentially developer surveys? Are some of them better suited to certain problems or others?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question I've been asking for 10 years. When I was asking these questions, and then as I've built different solutions and done research on this, I'm always asking, so why are we trying to measure things here? And I think the top reason that I see generally boils down to, how are we doing? Like, we want to know if we're good, if we're bad, how do we get better? More often that's translated as things feel slow. We want to know if that's true, and we want to know how to get faster. Or people are leaving. People seem frustrated. How do we see what's frustrating developers and make their lives better? I think that's generally the leading reason for an organization or a CTO. For platform and dev prod teams, like some of the folks we have today on this discussion, I think there's also a more existential reason. Like, if your job is to lead developer productivity, if your job is to make developers more productive, then you need some data to show that that's even a problem in the organization, right? And that your organization should exist and be funded. And then you need some way of showing whether any of the work you're doing is actually moving the needle and whether the investments are paying off. So I think there's that very existential reason. The third most common reason I would say is sort of the taboo one, which is like, who are our best engineers? Who's like quiet quitting? Who's slacking? And I think that's, when you look at all the research literature, it's there's pretty strong consensus that like the types of, especially sentiment data like we're talking about today, even the conventional metrics around things like cycle time and lead time, like those are not metrics you should be using to try to answer that question. So, but I'll just mention it because it still comes up a lot in discussions with leaders.
And would you say, I don't want to tell you what your opinion should be, would you say that it's important that when you start to adopt these, that you have an idea of what goal you want to solve, or should you just pick a framework and then that'll tell you what to do?
Definitely defining the goal. And I mean, that's true for any metric, not just engineering. And I would recommend folks check out, Google has a framework they've published called the Goals, Signals, Metrics that is prescriptive about how you should think about this. So you start with a goal, then you think about, okay, for this goal, what are the things we would observe that would indicate that we've met the goal? And then the last step is, what are some metrics that we could look at to tell us that these signals are actually happening? So it's a good way of backing into metrics, starting with a business goal.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I've seen it kind of come apart where you start to measure and then you're like, but what are we going to do with this?
Yeah.
So we've identified some goals. Let's now talk a little bit about how you can adapt and implement these frameworks to get started driving improvements within your teams. Adam, you've implemented different frameworks. What approaches and tools are you using to capture these metrics?
I think of there's this sort of idea out there, tyranny of metrics, which one of our EMs, Gergely Nemeth, has a really great blog post about that he put up there, that sometimes you kind of get ruled by these metrics, or sometimes they can be used to misconstrue information. Abhi, you mentioned the guardrails you kind of have to put on this pull request per engineer per month metric that seems to plague all of us in the industry. I saw smiles here, so we all know that fight that we've had. The ways that we've implemented this really are to, we talk about goal and what we're trying to measure. I think it's one thing to sort of just kind of say, okay, let's do some information gathering, some surveys to kind of find out how we're doing, which I think leaves out the empathy part of the job, where if that's the first thing you're doing, then you need to take a step back and just actually ask yourself, why don't you have a opinion right away about that? You might be new to a company, which means you need to kind of start talking to people. But really, it's the interviews that kick off first that you should do. Where, if you're an engineering leader, you can start talking to other engineering leaders. But honestly, what I like to do is just talk to engineers. The ones who are excited, I'd like to know why they're excited, what they love. The ones who are upset, I actually like to know what is causing you to tear your hair out, what is causing you to get frustrated. And with that data, you can start to think about, what do we want to prioritize? What do we want to do? What do we want to implement? Now, that's not to say that you can't take a look at like hard metrics. Like we've looked at build times, for example. And there's that Google paper also, which is about reducing the build times has a material effect on engineers. And that's like the whole paper cut syndrome, right? If you can reduce the amount of paper cuts and you can reduce time of these things that are done day in and day out, you can start to move that needle, right, in a direction that you can look at. But trying to measure this one big overall needle of the company, and there's no one metric, as we know, that satisfies all that. That should be one of the last things you do, and it should certainly not be a vanity metric either.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm curious now, David, looking at your team you could technically choose to adopt very similar practices. What was the biggest challenge that you faced when you started measuring any additional metrics or thinking about how to go about this?
Yeah, I think even if you have a very consistent, like common platform and everybody's using it, collecting and aggregating quantitative metrics is a long process. Like you're honestly going to be years out before you get everything that you want to have. And when you build your own, you're going to spend a lot of time validating that data. So I think that's why we pivoted to developer experience surveys as our primary source of data. But really, our biggest challenge, even in implementing developer sentiment surveys, was educating leaders about what to do with that survey data. And the perception that our developer platform team was solely responsible for driving improvements in any of those areas. So leaders and teams both asked us at the end of these surveys, when we do these readouts, what are you doing to address these problem areas like documentation or on-call experience? And in the platform team, of course, we have adjusted our roadmap based on the survey results. We use that as a key driver into what we're going to go build next. But we also spend a lot of time educating team leads on how to use that data to improve locally, and providing guidance to them on how to improve very specific drivers like documentation or on-call experience.
So Mariana, this is where you have an advantage. Being the person that actually leads product engineering, they know that if you're measuring, that means that you probably own the results. Can you tell me a little bit more about your approach to measuring any of these metrics? And then maybe you can touch upon, do you partner with a platform engineering team? Do you do this within your team? How do you make that happen?
So we use metrics across the whole technology organizations. Fortunately, I didn't need to convince myself that I need some data in order to make the right decisions. I also know from experience that implementing quantitative metrics is very, very expensive. So before I spend a lot of capacity or energy of a lot of people to actually implement something, I think really hard, what is the problem I'm going to solve? And then when I understand the problem, and before even I understand the problem, we used DX TrueLayer to highlight areas of the problem, problematic areas in the whole software development system. Like I don't mean technical, I mean human as well. And based on the size of the problem, we designed an approach to each problem individually. Going into the quantitative metrics, it's the last thing we actually do, because I know it's really very difficult to design metrics in a way that are very useful. And the most important thing I learned, when designing a metric, when you're actually spending time on it and designing it, it needs to be designed in a way that it's easy to adopt it. Because teams, so I also found like metrics has certain audiences. There is a leadership audience, there is a team audience, and there is an individual audience. So I found actually that the most important audience, it's actually not leadership, it's a team one, because if the metrics is designed with team in mind, with ease of use, with ability to engage with these metrics, the things will start to improve.
Definitely. And so you all kind of leaned on surveys are great. Let's ask questions. Avi, I'd love your perspective on when should people use qualitative or quantitative data?
I mean, the answer is folks should use both, right? I think they complement one another and have advantages and disadvantages. I would redefine qualitative and quantitative just for this conversation as self-reported versus system-based metrics. And as folks have already brought up, system data is great if it's available and if it gives us the insight we need. But so often it doesn't, and it's expensive to actually try to do so. So, for example, some types of questions that I don't think really any organization in our industry can answer well solely through system data. How much are developers interrupted? How much time do developers spend daily or weekly dealing with painful infrastructure issues? How easy is it for developers to actually understand and work with the code that they're supposed to be modifying? Or how often do weeks of work get wasted because a project wasn't defined well in the first place? Like, those are all really common paper cuts that affect developer productivity. I don't think there's a system metric that we can gather easily that tells us that. And that's where that self-reported data can give us such a more holistic picture into developer productivity and experience. Now, to your question of which one to use and how to use them together, I recommend starting with qualitative or self-reported data because it gives you that much more holistic, higher coverage lens into the problem. And then once you've identified where you want to drill in further or what you want to really focus on, that's where, if you can, quantitative data is great because it's real time. You can't run surveys every day to get a daily dashboard of a certain metric or even monthly. It's challenging. And so, drilling in with that quantitative or system-based data when it's merited, I think is a good approach, or if it's already available for a problem. So
I love that. That's a little bit like, using the OKR approach. So we've identified that documentation is a problem. What could we do to drive an improvement here? And what data do we have? Is it that no developers write documentation and we should improve that? Is there something along those lines? Does anybody have an example actually of a specific metric? Adam, you're off mute. Do you have a specific metric that you've measured with both qualitative and quantitative data?
Yeah, there's a couple. I mean, mostly I wanted to call BS on some of Avi's statements of not being able to measure interrupts, because you can, right? Like, one of the things we looked at was paging interrupts of on-call, and we measured those over time. And we catalog those things as part of a dashboard that we have in our dev console that's called Team Health. It's an entire place that just says, here's the amount of code reviews your team is doing right now. Here's the amount of pages that your team is doing. Here's the build failures that they're running into. So you're kind of measuring the human nature of defect rate when you're going through this, of like the funnel. But also, to your point, we are humans. There's no way that we can look at a example pattern of a human and then perfectly match it up and say, okay, this was an interrupt right here. There's folks either on the call for Meta or have heard of Meta where they have a lot of Big Brother technology where they look at, when are people typing, and they're trying to catalog, are they at work right now? Are they just jiggling their mouse with, caffeine to fake the system or not? And, I think you can kind of trick yourself into whatever data you want to do, looking at it. But, to the larger point, you talk about documentation, for example, and I think trying to measure how good is the documentation, very, very difficult. Right. I think this is where we have to rely on like the human brain as being the engine that can figure this out. I think, Avi, I forgot if it was you or someone else at the developer productivity conference last year, where that's the best, measurement tool we have. Have humans look at it and then say, is this productive or is this good? And then use that as a tool itself. So when you ask engineers to look at documentation, you basically give them a framework and you say, all right, uh, during your first minute, did you understand what the docs look like? During your first hour, did you understand what you wanted to do? During your first day, were you able to walk away with something, actually in hand? And during your first month, were you able to come back to it and to continue to evolve with it? And what we did with documentation was, obviously, when I got here, everyone said documents are awful, and they still say that to this day. I think everyone knows that that's sort of the ongoing problem. But we implemented code labs. So we implemented like step-by-step documentation that just told you how to do something. And that took off. That was something that spoke to the needs of the engineers and solved the problem rather than just going in and fixing typos in a wiki page, right? So you got to look beyond what's being asked. You have to ask, people for what they're satisfied with or not, and you have to sort of rely on that human brain aspect of it to drive your results.
That's so true. And that's exactly why you can't just measure the number of pages you have or the page views. There's really about how people use it and whether or not it drives an improvement in terms of their flow when they're in the moment coding. And so, okay, we've talked about metrics a little bit and how to implement these. These metrics are really only as useful as the improvements that you lead with them. So David, why don't you tell me a little bit about how you build roadmaps for your platform engineering organization and the teams?
Yeah. So, we start with our developer sentiment, our self-reported data. So, every quarter we're asking developers to rate their sentiment on specific drivers. One example would be, hey, please rate your following area of work: ease of setting up and running code locally. Is it bad? Is it so-so? Is it good? We turn around and we ask developers, rank the areas you'd like to see improved. And we also allow developers to provide free text responses, and we let them opt in to making these public comments. And most of them do, surprisingly. Some of these prioritized drivers that the developers have said that they want to see improvements on can be improved by the platform team in a central function, and some are going to require individual teams to improve those locally, but most often it's going to require collaboration between the two teams. So as a platform team, we typically select one or two of these drivers that we want to see improved over the next quarter. So our process is we go through and we immediately start mining the comments for areas of improvements. They're rich with data. We follow up and we'll conduct interviews that are individual or panel interviews based on interesting comments, or we use a sampling method that may pick out outlier responses within a specific team, or whether or not an individual marked a driver as a priority. And then we can correlate that sentiment on that driver with some or multiple quantitative system metrics. For example, in local environment setup, it could be, onboarding time to first PR, the lead time, the review turnaround time. So we're trying to go collect additional system data that can prove the point that we're trying to make about an area of an improvement. And then a huge feature is the ability to conduct like an in-the-moment survey. So once we've identified an area we want to see improvement, we'll create a specific survey that when the user completes an action, we can ask them a survey about how was that experience. So quarterly surveys are great for overall sentiment analysis, but they often fail to capture kind of those specific details, like what just happened. And it may have been months since the developer last experienced this pain point during the quarterly survey. So for our local environment setup example, when they merge their first PR to a repository, we can trigger a 2 to 3 question survey asking them about their experience. How was it to get your project tested and get your change merged in? More times than not, we're going to end up with a set of platform features to improve out of this methodology. So we communicate these roadmap changes often and widely that, hey, we're going to make improvements in these areas. We implement the change. We set a goal around seeing that quantitative system metric improve, as well as the qualitative sentiment driver improvement. We think it's important to pair these because we're going to see that quantitative system metric improve sooner than our next quarterly survey in an ideal world. So that's kind of our early indicator on whether we're making an improvement. And then we celebrate the improvement when we deliver it, when we see that driver sentiment increase, and we tie it directly to the new feature that we just delivered in our next post-survey communication. And this is a big part of how we continue to drive engagement with future surveys. And we want to make the developers feel like they investing the time and providing this data results in valuable changes. And I think that's why we continue to see 90% participation rate in our quarterly surveys, and we survey all engineers every 3 months.
That's really impressive, and I could not agree more. You have to celebrate. I think one thing you just said that many people could do, regardless of whether they're in a platform engineering org or in an engineering org, or they're even just a manager of an individual team, is you can literally lead a conversation about a specific topic to get deeper feedback. Pick something that you know anecdotally doesn't work, and then you can go and you do that. I love that you have this kind of three-prong approach to getting the data at the right time. So Adam, what's your approach?
I mean, a lot of things come to mind there. It just really first on the whole celebrating the wins. I couldn't agree more. I think that's a key part of that flywheel to get continued contribution. And as a platform team, platform teams in general, we got to remember we should not take the spotlight, right? It should be having our customers celebrate the wins that they've accomplished now with their teams, having their voice be heard. And then if we get thanked, great, whatever. But it really is. I hate to see sort of central teams patting themselves on the back when it was all the hard work of the product teams who are adopting everything, dealing with the bad documentation, as we talked about, dealing with the onboarding issues. So it's really about sort of having that that self of that cultural shift and that self-worth that they have. In terms of prioritizing, it always seems like a four-letter word for people. Like people kind of hate to hear it, like, oh, it's time to prioritize, and they kind of imagine these meetings behind closed doors where there's arguing and yelling, or rather just like sort of closing your eyes and throwing a dart at trying to do something. I found that what works is having a open dialogue with your customer. So we do this. We do our own surveys with developers, and honestly, I don't really ever find anything surprising there. Right? It's always the same things that bubble up: testing, development, documentation. No matter how many times you improve these things, those are just going to be part of the flow because that's what engineers work on. Right? It's you ask somebody, what are your complaints about getting to work? It's traffic, crowdedness. The tolls I pay, right? Those are always going to be there. You can make improvements, but those are going to show up time and time again. So for us, really, it's about understanding the various asks that people have, and then trying to derive overall solutions that get wins across multiple products. So David, you mentioned onboarding, right? And one of the things that we found is just even setting up the development environment is really, really tough, right? So one of the things that we're focusing on now is utilizing dev containers to spin up and have turnkey environments. And that's really nascent. That's just going to launch very soon. But we're already seeing huge wins with some of the pilots that we're doing on how we can speed that up. I don't think I'm going to get a metric that's going to measure that perfectly or be able to convince someone to prioritize this, right? That has to come from just firsthand knowledge, talking to people, chatting with people in the industry, trying out yourself and seeing where things are at. And then from there, I think you kind of derive, that sort of overall solution. I think that's our job, right? As leaders of these orgs, is to derive those solutions from the various parts, utilizing, all those great engineering leads, all those great ICs who are, begging you for change to get things done, all the the iconoclasts who are saying to, switch everything over to Rust, the various folks across the org. You weave it all together, and it doesn't feel like prioritizing anymore. It feels like you're just sort of collaborating on the right thing and just working with your customers to just really drive those solutions forward and get to those end wins.
I love that. You don't actually have to prioritize if you're actively working together and you have a common understanding of what those pain points are. So Mariana, as an engineering leader, you've already mentioned that you like to prioritize specific initiatives, and those are the initiatives and the projects that you drive across the team. What's your approach to prioritizing and deciding what you're going to tackle in any specific time frame?
I found DevEx very useful in prioritizing the pain points where it's where the problems are. And usually, I work in product engineering, so the problem space that I will see from DX would be different than somebody who works in platform engineering. It will be not like it from the different side. So some of the problems that we discovered would be on-call experience, or documentation. I believe I never saw organization yet that documentation is not one of the top drivers, to be honest. And we also used a combination of self-reported time of engineer spending on keep the lights on versus investment balance across the org. And we identified where the hotspots of KTLO are, in which team, in which areas of the org. And we are working with a product like to prioritize those areas of KTLO reduction activities. So it was very useful of this particular example of KTLO was very useful to introduce this common language of in the company. So it's easier to justify historically and not really difficult. Okay, this is product versus engineering. So that really helped like to create common understanding of where the problems are or where the technical depth is too high and we need to actually spend time and take it down. So I found structured surveys in addition to quantitative, like structured surveys, they show you where the problems are. After you understand where the problem is, it's combination of interviews, like if they highlight where the problem is. Then you go deeper, you understand, you talk to developers, you talk to managers, you talk to people, you find out like more details about the problems. And then if you have metrics already, you use the metrics, or if you really need to understand if improvements in this area of work, you implement these quantitative metrics, you spend effort and implement it in the right way. And combination of all of those things, they make efforts on optimizing the organization much more structured and impactful. And yeah, and also I do have to say that like structured surveys, when I join an organization, I need to find out like where the problems are, because I need help. I need to help the teams like to feel good, to deliver fast. And I usually spend in the beginning a lot of time trying like to understand where those problems are. Those structured DX in particular, they help me like to reduce this time that I try to find out where the problems, like I think from 6 months to a month, which was amazing. And
yeah, it's really awesome as an onboarding engineering leader. And I think one of the things that you just mentioned for me that I think is really powerful and important is you use data to help advocate for local individual product teams to make the time and to demonstrate how they could improve their velocity, their productivity, their experience by paying down that KTLO or the keep the lights on type work that just comes back that you have to do no matter what. And so maybe shifting gears a little bit, how do we get different product teams to focus on the areas that are most important for them? Because they have their own local development challenges, their own pain points, and specific things that might be highest priority for them. So maybe starting a little bit from your perspective, Abby, what's your approach to equipping all engineering teams to know when specific investments are required for their teams? And how do you help teams get to know that?
Yeah, this is such an interesting problem. Anyone who's gone on this journey, you spend all this time trying to figure out, what am I supposed to measure? How do we get the metrics? And you get all the metrics, and then you go, all right, how are we supposed to use these? How are the teams supposed to use this data? And it's like its own problem. I think I could probably boil down what I've seen down to 3 things. So, the first is you need to make the data available by team. And that's actually surprisingly difficult. At a lot of large organizations, you don't actually have data on who your teams even are. You have your HR data and Workday, but it's not reflective of your actual like pod or squad structure. So you have to get the data into that structure so that it's useful to those teams. I think another pitfall is giving folks too much data. Here's 50 metrics. Here's dashboard with a bunch of different stuff. Teams don't have time for that, right? And as you just alluded to, like you really want to distill it down to like 2 or 3 things that are the biggest opportunities for that team or the biggest things that the organization is trying to drive. I think it can be a bottoms up or sort of a tops down focus there. But either way, distilling it down to here are the things to focus on if you have 5 minutes and you're waking up and checking this thing on your phone, right? And lastly, to really, that the first 2 things I mentioned create engagement and value from the data. To really drive change, I think, does require incentives. It requires investment. It requires time given to teams to do this. I think one of the best ways to do that, or at least get that flywheel started, is just by making this information transparent, right? Scorecards kind of have a bad rep, but when you show everybody where they're at in comparison with others, that creates a natural incentive to at least dig into why that may be the case and whether or not improvements are merited. So just making the data transparent, making a list. Hey, here's where you're at. Here's where everyone else is at. Not in a weaponized way, but just in a way of making that data transparent, I think is a good way to get that flywheel started. But at the end of the day, it requires executive buy-in and push, I think, to get all teams in concert to strive for improvement. So it's a cultural thing that needs to be established by leadership.
Definitely. And I can see how the scorecard, it works a little bit like the hotspots that Mariana said. It's like, these are the areas that maybe you would want for your team. And maybe there are places you might be better off or places that you're worse, and it tells you where to start. That's great. So David, you've done quite a bit of work to try and collaborate with teams and get different product engineering teams to prioritize improvements. What are some of the ways that you've succeeded in getting to do that?
Yeah, 3 things: automation, guidance, and celebration. So, after a survey completes, we nudge team leads via chat to select areas for improvement. And of course, we're going to help them. We're going to show them, for your team, here are the areas that had a low sentiment, or here are the areas where your team said they want to see improvements. And the teams can can choose to make those improvements locally. They can also raise the flag that we need leadership support on the specific area to make improvements. We can't do it by ourselves. And they can provide additional details about what they need. And then we have a pretty rich library of documentation that says, okay, for this driver, here's how you can make improvements in your local team. Here are some recommendations. And they're categorized by, hey, here's some easy quick wins, all the way to these are going to be pretty hard and probably multi-quarter effort. For example, in one of the drivers, we have local environment setup. We have recommendations like keep your environment setup documentation updated. Create shared scripts that will automate the steps to get a repo checked out and running locally. And then, after past quarters where we've delivered platform features, we start to, encourage migration and adoption of those features. For example, use cloud development environments for your pre-provisioned dependencies. And we develop some scorecards around those so we can come back and say, hey, 30% of the repositories your team owns doesn't have the cloud development environment init script. Your peers have a higher adoption rate and they have a higher sentiment on this driver. And then we turn around and celebrate the improvements. We show the entire org who improved, what teams improved over the last quarter. We celebrate the team wins that made significant progress in our Voice of the Developer report. In our last snapshot, we saw 81% of the teams that had planned improvements in at least one driver, and 71% of those teams that planned improvements actually showed improvements. And we saw it in that specific areas like production debugging, test coverage, and incident response.
That's amazing. So you don't just celebrate, you also recognize the impact that it had. That's pretty great. So Adam, what are some ways that you've worked with managers to, recognize extracurricular efforts on platform and developer experience improvements?
Yeah, I mean, I just have to say I have such imposter syndrome listening to David and Avi here with everything and like the systems that they have in place and everything. And I have a lot of work to do apparently to catch up in this area.
It's pretty easy. You could just talk to Avi.
Yeah, I
Write him a
know, I
check.
know, I know, I know, I know. But you know, I think the big thing that I'm just kind of seeing the theme here is just the celebrating the wins part. And there's like, again, it kind of just goes back to like the human aspect of this, right? You know, at the end of the day, we're all just trying to put software together to, either deliver a SMS message or to deliver food via an SMS message, right? It comes down to we're all driving towards the shared goal of what our company is geared towards, and we're all trying to work together on this. I think luckily I cut my teeth through developer relations before I became a traditional code monkey, and was able to work directly with engineers through advocacy. And if you think platform engineering is hard, going one step further and then trying to talk to engineers that you can't even talk to because they're behind sort of that pane of glass is the World Wide Web, and you're trying to sort of push change out there. It's extremely difficult to do, which is why I feel lucky when I'm at a company that it's easy, right? It's I can chat to a fellow colleague on Slack, get coffee, and then start to talk about hey, what can we do to get you in the monorepo, right? And it's a bit of that negotiation, but really it's just that relationship building. And if you are a leader of a platform team, you need to be the chief evangelist of your platform team. You need to be out there constantly talking about what your peers are doing at the company and what awesome stuff they're coming up with. You need to be pulling folks in, having insider programs, having your own developer advocates within your group, really just sort of drumming up that interest and creating that social network. And then in terms of like the extracurricular activities, it's a double-edged sword. I love when an engineer has a great idea and then starts running with it. I also sometimes get a little knot in my stomach when I see that, because it's, oh no, as much as I want that, what's the plan for 2 years from now on that thing that they came up with, right? That one script that they have that now an entire company runs on top of. So really you have to kind of get the great ideas, get the motivated folks, and then help kind of have all those streams of work connect into that sort of one large river there of that push, right? And help guide it towards that one solution. Very difficult tightrope walk of finding that balance, not demoralizing, getting people still excited on what they have, still feeling ownership, but then knowing that in terms of, as we said, cutting a check or footing the bill, your platform team has to sort of own that over time and continue to invest in it also. So yeah, I think just get out there and talk to folks, whether it's the other leaders or the engineers, just to get your stuff done.
Great. So we're just about at the top of the hour. We got 10 minutes left for questions. I'm going to ask you a really quick question, all of you. I want to try and do it really quick, and then I'll get to the audience questions. Any questions we don't get to, we're going to answer on Slack. So go and add more. If you have a question top of mind, go ahead and do that. So quick question. We likely all have a lot of members. There's a lot of members of the audience that probably haven't done this yet. They might just be getting started. Knowing what you know now, what would you recommend in terms of getting them going? So Mariana, what's one action you would recommend?
So one thing, the most important thing for me was, when designing a metric, design it with the team in mind. Design it in a way that it sets it up for success, so the teams adopt the metric, so they're willing and empowered to use the metric.
Amazing. David?
Perception is reality. So head straight to sentiment surveys. And don't fall into the trap of not invented here. Good survey questions are very hard to design. So use battle-tested questions that exist out in the marketplace and build automation around it.
Great. Adam?
Start to catalog everything and everybody. I think the number one thing that everyone always forgets is who owns what is key to solving anything. I have a laundry list of stuff of, if I ever start a company, what am I going to do from day one? And it's going to be implement a group directory, a team directory, and a catalog of services, and just start that from day one. But if you don't have that, start doing it now and just start collecting all that.
Did my team pay you to say that? Because I think
No, but yeah, it's Spotify and Backstage, right? Like that, the asset catalog and what they go by. It's just every time anyone starts at a company, they just go, I have no idea who anyone is or what people own, and it's just you got to solve that from day one, right? Or you wish you did.
And Avi, what would be your recommendation other than, of course, probably using DX to ask survey questions?
Not whether you use DX or not. I think as has already been said, starting with self-reported data, not making the mistake of going down that Git metric rabbit hole. Is it commit data? Is it PR cycle time? I spent 7 years, built 2 companies that did that, and at the end of it, still didn't feel satisfied at all with the data that we were generating for answering the question of how productive are we. So, start with self-reported. It's much faster to get it going. It's going to give you great data, and then follow it with system data where you want to drill down further. I only really heard that clearly expressed by researchers at Google about 8 months ago, and that was everything I wish I knew, 10 years ago myself.
All right, so we're going to answer a few of the audience questions now. Maybe starting with metrics. So what are some good numbers for these metrics? When do you declare success? How do you know how your company compares to other metrics? Albie, I think you probably have a good answer for this.
Yeah, I mean, industry benchmarks are really helpful because especially with self-reported data and some of the softer areas that we measure, like how do developers feel about the quality of the code? Like that's really hard to contextualize without benchmarks because look, as many people said on this call, I think Adam mentioned, like everyone's always not fully satisfied with code quality and tech debt and documentation. So the industry benchmarks give you a point of view into, okay, there's problems here, but are they bigger problems than is typical in an organization? So yeah, industry benchmarks are really helpful.
And I know DORA has DORA.dev. Are there any others that are out publicly that people can Google that you know of?
Not really. I mean, there's some sources. At DX, we plan to start openly sharing benchmark data soon. So something we're hoping to do.
That's great. Right. So a question I get asked a lot as well is, when does every company need a platform engineering or an enabling team? If not, what do we do? How do we manage these different things? And at what point should we also think about creating that team? Mariana.
So at TrueLayer, the enabling tech ops team was created fairly early on. Is before we are scale up. So before we started to grow really fast, that was the time when the team was created, and it was a really good investment at that time because it allowed a lot of efficiency later.
My last role, I didn't do it fast enough. And so in this role, within my first 3 months, I created the team, and they've already had great success having an impact in helping our product teams build in things in a very generic way. And so I think as soon as you can would be my advice as well. So thinking about examples, what are some examples? Maybe the question is specifically around metrics, but I'd open it up to also potentially say goals, OKRs that are tied to these metrics that organizations have used, which have had like good corrective actions, or maybe what's one of the biggest productivity wins you've had with one of your investments as well. David, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, I think we typically choose our metrics and our goals around how do we improve the sentiment around this specific area. We're definitely going to back that up with, an MTX metric around, time to restore a service, or we're trying to improve something around incident management. A recent example we've had is, rolling out a very common platform feature around logging, traceability, and just broader observability. And of course, that was driven by a very low sentiment in production debugging and on-call experience. So I think good metrics there, right, is, your mean time to detect, mean time to recover, and, just the sentiment on what is it like to be on call. You may not change the number of pages out of that experience, but hopefully you're improving the experience of responding to those pages. And yes, you should set a goal around the number of pages as well. But I think that's a good good example of, a metric and how to combine the sentiment and the quantitative system level data.
Abhi,
Just-
no.
Well, I was going to say, just to add to David's point, the on-call, what we've started measuring was after hours on-call interrupts. So it's not so much just when you're at work, but, is your engineer being woken up at night? And, the best way to fix on-call is to put your director on the chain and have them woken up in the middle of the night, because I guarantee it'll be fixed the next day. It's a joke aside, they care a little bit more than that. But we were measuring that across the team, right? So, this goes back to the team health, because if an engineer is being woken up at 2 a.m., they're not going to be able to do their best work the next day. And then there's also the human aspect. I don't want my engineer being woken up at 2 a.m. because, some system that might not even be something that they own has gone down. So we put that together, and we divided that by the Eng org, and then we review that once a month with all the other VPs. And it's not to call anyone out, but it's just to sort of have that benchmark across each org of, oh, this org has been improving. Okay, what did you guys do to improve? And then that can kind of help guide the other Eng leaders who also want to do that too. It just sort of helps also just put that humanity to it too, of just, hey, we have a problem here of people not being able to sleep at night. That's step one that we have to fix here.
You talked about humanity. I think there's a really hard question here about collaboration. So if developers are happy with the work and the tooling, but collaboration is starting to become an issue, how do you identify what to fix? How do you measure? What do you measure? Mariana, you nodded a lot there.
So collaboration was and continues to some extent be an issue for us as well. So it showed very high on the sentiment on the survey. So it's very difficult. The collaboration is it's a lot of things. And so the way we went about it, we conducted a lot of interviews with the different roles, not just engineering. And we tried to find out exactly what it was. For us, it turned out to be not a great dependency management. So the teams that were satisfying dependencies for other teams were doing it on a best effort basis instead of scheduling, and it created a bit of a I cannot collaborate. So it's going and asking a lot of questions around it. I don't think we did not create any quantitative metrics about collaboration, but we did improve our planning processes and how we think about dependency. We're still working on it. It's not done. It's not an easy problem to solve, but that's definitely was a problem for us as well. And like asking exactly what is the problem with collaboration. Sometimes you can be surprised. It can be not what you think it is.
Adam?
It's always support. That's what is the word for, instead of collaboration, it's support. If you just replace the word collaboration with support, you tend to actually start to derive what the issue actually is. A lot of times it's, you ask, what would you do from day one? I think, so since DoorDash did almost all of its major hiring during the pandemic, right at the start of it, the majority of the company was completely remote, has never worked face-to-face, and has completely relied on Slack for support. And we have these ask channels. And while they're great that you can sort of get another engineer to start talking to, it gives the impression that support is going to be real time. And it can't be, right? Because engineers have to, even platform teams have to code sometimes, right? And the more that you need approval from these platform teams, the more that you need support from the platform teams just to do the basics, the more that the product engineering team feels blocked. And then they're going to surface that as it's hard to collaborate with platform teams, right? And then likewise, the platform team is going to say it's hard to collaborate with product engineering teams. When they mean that, they say adopting the stuff that we're putting out there, right? So it's not just looking at the word and just sort of saying, oh, that just means playing nice. It just means, sort of being blocked by each other. And, you have to kind of look beyond that and say, David mentioned automation, like how do you solve self-service, right? So that people aren't waiting on approvals anymore. How do you solve tooling so that things spin up for you quickly? How do you automate support through AI chatbots, which we've been experimenting with? Those are the way to the solution of that problem of collaboration.
Absolutely. So we just made it to the top of the hour. So we're going to wrap it up with that last question. Thank you, everyone, for your great insights and for answering these questions. I hope everyone in the audience has a few key takeaways to help you measure and improve the overall developer experience, not just their productivity, but hopefully the experience of them on your teams. Thanks to each of the panelists for sharing your expertise. We're all heading over now to the Lead Dev Slack channel in the Effective Teams channel. Please head there to continue the discussion. We're going to copy over any questions that we didn't answer. Thanks for joining and hope to see you next time.